Welcome to Veterans AZ. In today's episode, we sit down with Matt Unsworth, who served both his country and his community in powerful, lasting ways. He's a U.S. Army veteran who deployed to Iraq in 2004. Today, he brings that same sense of duty, discipline, and perspective into the classroom as a high school history teacher. We'll talk about his experiences in Iraq, the vital role logistics plays in military campaigns, and how he helps students connect the past to the present through lived experience. This is a story about service, education, and the lasting impact of both. Welcome. I am here with Matt Unsworth, a United States Army veteran who today is a high school teacher here in the Phoenix area. And we're here to learn about both his military service and also how he's taken that experience into the classroom. So thanks so much for joining us, Matt.
The pleasure is all mine.
Let's start with your story. What led you to join the Army, and how did you end up in a quartermaster service company?
Both my dad and my granddad had military service. Granddad was in the Army, Dad was in the Marines. When it came time to go to school, the Army offered me a 3-year scholarship to go to the school that I wanted to go to, which was University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. So I went Army. I was commissioned in 1994, and I had originally wanted to be in the Armor Corps and drive tanks, but the Army sends you where they need you, not where you want to. So I got to learn the wonderful world of supply and logistics. And I was commissioned in 94. I did my training out at that time. It was called Fort Lee in Virginia. And then when I was done with that training, I was assigned to the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Fort Polk, Louisiana. And I stayed there until 1998. At that time, my active duty time was done, and I came back to Arizona and transitioned to the National Guard and then the reserves.
Did you have any expectations going in to your military service? And if so, were they met, or did the reality offer something different?
I really wanted to see different parts of the country. I was born and raised here in Arizona, and I love this state. It's beautiful, but I wanted to see other parts of the planet. Louisiana was not my first choice, but I'm really glad I went. It is a beautiful state, and I got to work with some wonderful people. It was actually really the first time in my life that I worked with people who didn't look like me, who didn't sound like me, who didn't talk like me. And that, I think, was really important later on when I became a teacher. When I was done with active duty in 98, I really wanted to go back to Arizona. That's where my family was. That's where my friends were. My wife graciously agreed to follow me out to the desert, and we've made a life for us here. So my initial expectation of going out and seeing the world may not have been met, but I really appreciate the time we spent in Louisiana. Got to go see Battle of New Orleans too while we were there.
So talk about a little bit the transition from full-time active duty into the National Guard. What was that like?
That was a little difficult for me. National Guard moves at a different pace than active duty Army, and the National Guard was actually a bit slower in paying me than the active duty was. So after I was with the National Guard for about 4 or 5 months, I decided I wanted to go to the Individual Ready Reserves, which was basically, we'll call us, we'll call you, don't call us. And then in 2002, I got a phone call saying, hey, we need you. We're going to assign you to this reserve unit now. And then I got assigned to the 751st Quartermaster Unit out of Mesa, Arizona.
And so with that unit, you ultimately deployed to Iraq in 2004, is that correct? Tell us what that was like. What was it like to get that call and realize that after a fairly long period of military service in different capacities, you were finally going into a war zone?
Yeah, I had made a successful transition to civilian life. I really enjoyed teaching. I was at a private school for students with emotional difficulties. And then I got a phone call from an Army placement officer out of Chicago, and she said she was going to assign me to a unit out of Mesa, Arizona. And that's where I was then sent. And that was in, I want to say, October of 2002. And by January of 2003, we were being sent up to Fort Lewis, Washington, and getting ready to mobilize for the war in Iraq. It was kind of a head spin because my son had been born 2 days after we invaded Afghanistan, and my wife was pregnant with my daughter at the time. We didn't know the gender. and my daughter would be born on July 29th, 2003 while I was over in Iraq. So it really kind of, like anyone who was there, I really felt like I had one foot here and one foot over there.
And so help us understand what the day-to-day pace and activity is like for a quartermaster unit in Iraq and during that time.
Well, but the entire time we were at Fort Lewis, we were getting trained up to do a mission over in Iraq, but they didn't really have a mission for us. And then we got deployed into Kuwait, and we spent the month of June in Kuwait kind of waiting for a mission to be assigned to us. And we really didn't get that assigned to us until late June. And so by the time our unit completely moved into our base at Taji, Iraq, which is about 10 minutes north of Baghdad, we had finally been assigned a warehouse job where that mission was to resupply and re-equip the new Iraqi army. And so part of that involved consolidating weapons, equipment, uniforms, pretty much anything a soldier would need. Those would be sent to our warehouses at Taji, where we would consolidate them, clean them, get them ready for reissue, and then give those to customer units whose primary job was training up the new Iraqi army, and that they would take that equipment and ship it to them. That was our main mission, but we also had a fuel platoon that ran refuel operations in Taji. In addition to providing security for us while we were there, we had a water platoon. They issued over 1.5 million gallons of fresh drinkable water to the units that were on the base as well as the local units. And we also did work with local schools, giving them new supplies and equipment that were generously donated, mostly by the school that I was at, things like paper and pencils. There was a lot of desks that we had at Taji that weren't being used, so we got the school desks sent to them. We kind of got called on to do whatever needed to be done, and since we were the first wave there was a lot that needed to be done.
So describe your relationship as a unit or even as individuals with the Iraqi community at that time.
In the beginning, we didn't really have a lot of contact. When we rolled into Taji, it had been declared mission accomplished back in May, but winning the peace was going to take work. And so we had very strict rules for how to interact with the locals and what that interaction could look like. Our first major contact with them was going in with our water platoon and refurbishing an ice factory. We were able to purify the water that was being fed into the ice factory, which could then be made into consumable ice. And we had a good relationship with those folks. As time went on, we had a good relationship with the local sheikh who was orchestrating things in and around Taji. That's how we got permission to go and resupply the schools. And the longer we were in the theater, the more and more contact we had with locals. Most of those were overwhelmingly positive. Some of them, we tend to think that their presence on our post may have sometimes resulted in indirect fire later on, but I would say that was very much the exception and not the rule.
I'm fascinated. You had mentioned supporting a local school. So obviously the war is very catastrophic to a community, but you personally sounds like tried to do what you could to help them reestablish things like schools.
Yes, I'm very proud. We went over with 100 soldiers, and they were all very dedicated to the job that they needed to be done. They were very professional. This was also when the Department of the Army extended reserve unit deployments. We had been mobilized in January, and the way the orders were originally written is that you would be mobilized for 365 days from that mobilization order. So when we got there in June, July, we thought, okay, we're going to be able to get home, around New Year's. And it wasn't until September when we got word that that had been changed to 365 days from the day you arrived in Kuwait. So that hit the soldiers really hard, but that never stopped the quality of job that they did and never stopped their professionalism. Over time, our company's strength actually got whittled down to 80, but that was not through enemy contact or action or enemy fire. It was from people being injured on the job or having an emergency at home that they were released for. But at the end of those 100 days, those 80 soldiers were ready to go home.
I bet. Tell us a little bit more about supporting the local school. I'm curious about Was that part of your official duties, or was that something that you all assessed as a need in the community and thought, well, we've got ways to help?
If I remember correctly, the commander of the entire base, he was a full bird colonel. He had wanted to improve relations with the locals, and one of those was the necessity to rebuild the schools. So there was a all-girls school that was within, I want to say, 10-minute truck drive from where we're at, and he put out, if anyone can do anything to help with the schools, please let us know. And so I talked to my boss, we both talked to the colonel together. I said, I work for a private school back in Peoria, Arizona. I know all I have to do is write them and say, here are supplies that are needed, and they'll send them. That's exactly what happened. The colonel gave us the blessing to go make contact with the school, tell them what we could offer. Once the boxes arrived, we were able to make that run out. That was completely conducted by our unit. Lots of volunteers who wanted to go work with kids. And that was probably one of the more rewarding missions that I got to do while I was there. It made me feel that was why we were there and we were doing good things.
Well, I agree. It sounds like an outstanding example of sort of the other duties as assigned, as we joke, or in this case, other duties as determined needed to occur. How would you explain the overall importance that you've mentioned, water, and even something that we absolutely take for granted here in Arizona, something like ice? How would you explain the importance of supply and logistics in an environment like that?
I would have to steal the words of one of my instructors at Fort Lee back in 1994, and in the first week, of course, we had all these young officers there ready to learn about logistics, and he drew a picture of a spear on the dry erase board, and he pointed to the tip, and he said, this is what gets all the attention. This is the pointy part that we use to kill people with, but you'll notice that what you hold the spear by is really what makes it work. And he said, you guys are the shaft. You are going to be the one that allows the war fighters to do their job. You guys are going to be the victory bringers. Without you, they don't get bullets, they don't get gas, they don't get food, they don't get fuel. They can do nothing without us. And that really opened my eyes as to the importance of logistics. Growing up, I had read a lot of military books that had all focused on strategy and tactics, but that officer impounded to me that amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. And that also has helped me actually in teaching about like the Civil War or World War II, the great logistical effort or chain of supply that is required in order to achieve those big victories.
And so yet another example of how your military service is something that you can carry into the classroom today. So I want to talk more about that part. After you completed your deployment to Iraq, what did your military service look like from that point?
When I got back, I realized that my service meant a lot to a lot of people, a lot more than I thought it really should. My wife threw a big party for me coming home. That was kind of uncomfortable for me because I did not necessarily think I needed recognition for what needed to be done. There were people who did so much more. But once that transition was over and I got to reintroduce myself to my son and meet my daughter, I was able to take what I had done over there and start kind of like sneaking into the classroom. So like while I was at that private school, I was teaching world history. So when we did ancient civilizations, I had the opportunity to go to Babylon on a tank recovery mission. And so I had pictures of Babylon that I was able to incorporate into the lesson and use that to kind of help lay that groundwork. As I made the transition to teaching US history at my current school, or at public school when I went into, I was able to say, here are reasons why the United States gets into conflicts, here are the causes, and then here are the effects. And mostly the causes are people touch our boats. We don't like it when people touch our boats. And when conflicts happens, here's how the United States goes about fighting them.
And are there any other unexpected similarities or lessons that you've taken from your military service into the classroom?
I try really hard for my students to see me as Mr. Unsworth, not Captain Unsworth. It is not something that I introduce into the class like officially. If students ask me, I will tell them. Interestingly enough, if I learn that a student is from Iraq, I'm usually much more open with them about that, so they know my background. But as far as incorporating my experience, I would say it would be probably much more about what anyone would learn in the military, is the importance of being prepared, the importance of having a plan, making sure that that plan is going to be, you can hand it to a substitute teacher, and the teacher can then carry off with that plan, and just being a presence in the classroom that the students know and trust. It's not about barking, it's not about yelling, it's about the students knowing who you are, knowing what the routine is, and knowing that they can trust you even to give a wrong answer.
How generally would you say the students respond when they learn you're a veteran? Do they, is there any particular response that stands out in your mind?
Yeah, usually it goes along the lines of, "You're in the Army?" "Yes, I was in the Army." "What'd you do?" "I followed orders." "No, what was your job?" "I fed people." "Oh, what was that like?" "Well, people needed food and I give it to them." And then sometimes they'll go along, "Did you ever kill anybody?" And it's like, "Really? Do you want me to talk about that?" "No, I guess I don't." But then usually it ends about right there. Again, I want them to see me as Mr. Unsworth, not Captain Unsworth. And that's a relationship I'm comfortable with.
Let's talk a little bit more about your educational focus on history. How did you end up as a history teacher? Was it something you sought out, or was that also something that was assigned to you?
When I was younger, I think I had a lot of misunderstandings of my own capabilities. I had originally wanted to go to University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington to study marine biology. But semester and a half of chemistry and biology and math taught me that I was not good at that. And after a long discussion with my parents that, no, it's okay, D stands for diploma, I had always liked history, and so I switched my major to that. And I'd always liked ancient history, so I took a lot of classes on Rome and Greece, but I also took a lot of courses on U.S. history. And so when I graduated, my degree was in U.S. history, was in history. And so that when I decided to be a teacher, I had that I could fall back on. When I was done with active duty, I needed to go to ASU West and get some certification credits to teach. Having a history degree wasn't enough. And so I went through the accreditation process, and at the same time I was working at that private school, and that worked out really well. I was able to teach at the private school and get paid for that while going to school to become a teacher. And my daughter is actually going through the same process right now.
Well, that's outstanding to hear as well. We need more good teachers, that's for sure.
No argument from me.
Could you give an example of a lesson or something you do in the classroom that combines your military background and the topic of history in a way that you think is particularly impactful to your students?
Probably when we talk about World War II. The approach that I take is, why did the Allies win? And the three reasons that we drive home was Allied air superiority, the Russian front, and the one that I really hit home is American industry. And so from there, we're able to look at how the United States was able to mobilize its industrial base and how it was able to put a huge number of people to work. And at that point, we can talk about women and minorities being a very important part of the factory work that went into it, and how that's going to actually jumpstart the civil rights movement after World War II, as well as the new feminist movement that takes place in the 1950s. But that all ties back into how the United States went about fighting that war. And in the previous semester, we talked about the Civil War, and we talked about the differences between the North and the South. And so then we can use that as a continuation, that all this industrial capacity that the foundation was laid in the 1860s, we are now going to really start capitalizing on it in the 1940s. The only other time that I'm able to kind of make a direct connection with that is towards the end of the year when we talk about 9/11 and the war on terror. Then I'm able to make it a little bit personal, but the emphasis isn't on me, it's about what our foreign policy was.
I know after having had the honor of interviewing your father, a Vietnam veteran, that you also have an opportunity during the module on the Vietnam War to bring in some veterans such as him.
Yep.
And to let the students meet and talk to them. So tell us a little bit about what that's like.
It's one of my favorite lessons. My father-in-law He was in the United States Navy for 30 years. He actually retired in 1998. And he and my father are both Vietnam veterans. And the way we set up that lesson is the day prior, I will have laminated photographs that they both took while they were in Vietnam, and I'll have those spread around the student desks. And so the day before, the students will look at the photographs, they'll write down questions that they have about them, or they'll write down questions that they have about what the Vietnam conflict was like, or they might just write down questions, what's it like to be a veteran? And so the next day when the two gentlemen come in, it's my father and my father-in-law, the students then just ask the questions and then they fire back with the answers. It's always kind of amusing when I introduce them as Mr. Unsworth and Mr. Ellis. Then my students will do a double take, and sometimes they'll ask me if that's my brother up there, and I take that personally, but my dad loves it. And it's one of my favorite lessons, and when I get student feedback at the end of the year, it's one of their favorite lessons too.
So what do you hope your students take away from an experience like that, or just from the overall sprinkling in of some military experience into a broader discussion of history? What is it you hope they're taking away, or do you think or know or see that they're learning from that combination of things?
I honestly don't want my students to memorize names, dates, and facts out of my class. I want them to become critical thinkers. And part of coming up with their own questions to interview is part of that critical thinking process, to look at how history changes or continues over time, the causes and the effects. And what I want them to take out of my class is the ability to think and the ability to think critically. But with the interview, it's a reminder that history is just not names in a book. It's not just a video that we'll watch. There is literally history all around us. It never goes away. The past is not past. It's always here. And having my father and father-in-law come in with those talks is a reminder that history is literally one person away. And that's what I want to impart upon them.
Are there any students that have that you're aware of, or who have stayed in contact with you, who have gone on potentially to serve in the military? Or
yep, several. They have gone on and they stay in touch with me. I'm also very flattered and honored that I've had about 5 of my former students go on to become teachers. And then many of them have actually come back to observe me in the classroom too. And that's just about the highest honor I could get.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my last question. For young people thinking about military service, or for veterans or anyone else thinking about becoming an educator, what advice would you give them?
Well, for those folks who are going into the military, I would say it is a great way to see a different part of the world that you haven't seen before. Probably the best thing that came out for me is the ability to work with other people, and the importance of knowing your job and doing it well. It taught me a lot about how to be a professional. And that's going to be imparted upon you no matter if you go in enlisted or an officer. It's going to make you a better person. As far as making a transition into education, I can say education is probably one of the most demanding jobs you can get, and that's with a combat deployment in Iraq under my belt. It is a hard job. It is a fantastic job, and it is a way to pass civilization on from one generation to the next, and that's a really important thing to remember, and that's something that I want to tell myself on a pretty regular basis.
Are there any plans for future history lessons in the classroom? What's another big idea you might have to provide a unique sort of experience for your students?
I really enjoy the opportunity to have students participate in lessons rather than me just talking. So we'll do simulations where they refight the war for independence. We'll do debates over laws that Andrew Jackson is passing. We'll have a back and forth discussion on whether or not the New Deal was successful. But probably the one that I look forward to the most, and the one that I'm always trying to tweak, is the lesson or the question I ask my students at the beginning of the year, and I ask them throughout, is the United States a city on a hill? And I ask that at the end of every unit, and the last lesson I have with them on the last day, they discuss it in small groups and we discuss it as a class. does our country shine as an example for others? And they have to be able to use information that they've learned in class and apply those critical thinking skills like we've talked about. It can't just be yes or no, you have to explain why, and it can't just be current events. You have to look at where we've come from and where we are. And that is a great lesson, and that's the one that I always want to kind of tweak and make better every time.
Well, it sounds like you're providing a wonderful experience for your students, and leaning in part on your background and on your family legacy of military service. So I really appreciate you being here today and sharing that with us. Is there anything we've missed? Is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap up?
Nope. I think you asked all the questions that I'm comfortable with answering. And this was a really wonderful opportunity, and I thank you for making the time, not only for myself, but for my father. Things like this are important, and I appreciate being a part of it.
Well, we appreciate you being here, and again, thank you for serving our next generation with such dedication. We appreciate it, Matt.
Thank you kindly, sir.